I think everybody's on part of that.
Who can say anything they want to say?
Let's take this one as now as we can make our persuasion. Yeah, exactly. They might not be scared. You know what I mean?
That's nice.
Okay, thanks everyone for coming. I'm going to go ahead and start. If the field office, I don't know if they hear us or not, but hopefully people are watching from their desks on the URL. But I'm delighted to welcome Dr. Chris Seiple here to GAO. We met him on our recent engagement. We were looking at international religious freedom. And Dr. Seiple is the president and founder of, president of the Institute for Global Engagement. His father and his mom founded it. It's a global think and do tank, as Chris likes to say, that works for building sustainable religious freedom worldwide through local partnerships. And Chris was a great help to us on our previous engagements. He, among his various roles, he is a member of the Council on Foreign Relations. He's a senior advisor to the Secretary of State's Strategic Dialogue with Civil Societies Working Group on Foreign Policy and Religion. And so he's really, IGE is one of the very few NGOs, possibly the only one that's really working at the nexus of religion and foreign policy. And as we in government know, I think we generally have a difficult time dealing with religion. It's not something that we deal with a lot, but I think, as hopefully Chris will talk a little bit about, we ignore it at our own peril, particularly in the issues we work in. It touches almost every aspect of many of the issue areas that we work in at GAO and throughout the government. So you all have seen his bio. I don't want to take up more time in the presentation, but please join me in welcoming Dr. Chris Seiple.
Good afternoon. Thanks for coming out. Glad more than Brian is here. 10 minutes ago the room was empty except for Brian. He promised to ask a lot of questions, so I'm pretty good about that. There actually is another NGO that's similar to ours that you would appreciate hearing from. It's the International Center for Religion and Diplomacy, who was founded by Doug Johnson. And that's important for two reasons. One is Doug is kind of the grandfather of the field. He wrote a book called Religion, the Missing Dimension of Statecraft back in 1994 and kind of reintroduced the reality of the world to political scientists that religion and faith matters. That's a shot at political scientists, if you didn't know. And I come from the international relations world. But I also mentioned that the second reason is Doug Johnson is a huge fan of seersucker suits. And I had breakfast with him this morning, so that's why I am in this sartorial splendor. I just want to say, Doug, I love you where you're at. And that's kind of what the whole point of the presentation is to talk about how you engage, respect, move from tolerance to respect with people who don't vote or look or act or pray like you do, but yet you got to deal with them. And hopefully you deal with them out of a position of respect as opposed to a position of tolerance. So that's what I want to talk about. In general, I want to talk about global trends from a personal perspective and challenge you to figure out what your personal perspective is. And then I'm going to look at this, what does this look like in the American policy context, thinking about a place like Afghanistan and Pakistan. And then bring it down into, okay, how is one little NGO, we're only 10 people, nonprofit, 501c3, how do we try to deal with this in the world that we engage in with examples from East Asia primarily. So that's where we're going today. Madam, mind the way. Okay, first off is how do you give people permission to talk about this? Wherever we go, I've found that the number one thing is that everybody's got a subconscious or conscious roadblock for talking about religion and politics, right? In the American cultural context, but also many around the world, you don't talk about religion and politics in polite company. Assuming Brian keeps polite company. It's up for grabs. But you have to have a permission within yourself and then with others to talk about it. And if you've got to come at it at some point from your own moral standard, which I'll get to. But how do you do that in circles of realpolitik and of hard power and of all those kinds of things? Soft power is a little bit easier. Of course, we talk about faith because that's all touchy-feely. Let's all go hug a tree and do some good. But what about the hard power stuff, the real nettlesome issues that are out there? I find that grand strategy is a way to do that, especially with the hard power folks. Grand strategy often is reduced to hard power, but it is a comprehensive construct that says we have to use all the elements of national power in peace and in war. Hard power and soft power. One of the elements of our national power is religious freedom. It is not a bipartisan issue. It is a nonpartisan issue that goes to our founding. It is about how we respect other people and allow them to be in the same space and let them bring their beliefs to bear, their beliefs or their non-beliefs. The point is you respect somebody's moral framework and where they're coming from. That helps people think about security issues, especially from the security sphere, a little bit better. Another example is from this guy, Ferdinand Eberstadt, who I've never heard of, but for policy geeks like me, he did a report in October 45 that became the basis for the National Security Act of 1947, which set up the National Security Council, the CIA, the DOD, Pentagon, and the Air Force. And this was his vision of security. It's a mosaic of relationships. All these elements are brought together. And we have to find a way to bring them together in a coherent fashion. He was chagrined, as was George Kennan, when these kinds of broad ideas were reduced to a military response to the Soviet Union, which began after the June 25th, 1950 invasion of Korea. That's when a broad understanding of security gets reduced to a military response, and then you militarize your national security, which should be an oxymoron. Your national security should be this broad picture of hard and soft power that you're trying to apply wisely, in particular contexts. But we lost the ability to talk about religion, and we militarized our national security. And it's got to be both and. In some ways, we're recovering all these things. And that's been accelerated in recent days by the fact that we don't have any money. So we got to try something else. Well, why not try faith? Everything else has failed. And faith is not a panacea, but we've got to include it as an analytic factor, at the very least. Okay, next one. So here's the world according to Seiple. Here's that mosaic. All these issues on the right-hand side have a couple common features. None of them can be solved by any state or non-state actor, any government or NGO. So the second characteristic by default is it's not a question of if, but when you partner. If I want to have impact on these issues, I've got to work with this Venn diagram if I want to have impact. And MOD is your Ministry of Defense. It's kind of an international slide there. UN, IOs, religion, NGOs. How do you operate at that nexus point? Which is also to say, whether you realize it or not, conscious or subconscious, if you want to have influence on these issues and therefore have influence in these relationships, you will de facto exhibit a philosophy or a theology of the other. When the Pentagon engages the State Department, they're going to demonstrate a philosophy of the other. Of course, the irony is with those two tribes, they both say the same thing about each other, right? Those people across the river. It's the human condition you define against, as we've seen everywhere, from Hutu and Tutsis to Sunni and Shia, to Protestant and Catholic. But you have to, what is your philosophy of the other? That's the question you have to ask yourself, even in interagency stuff. Okay, next one. So, here's where you're going to get squirmy. I happen to be a Christian. I'm not proselytizing you now. But I've got to take a look in my heart and say, what is it about my text that teaches me about the other? So for me, this is the example of Jesus at the well in Gospel of John. Now, whether you believe anything about him or not, or you don't think the story is real or not, I happen to believe it's real, so you have to respect me for that. And then you've got to respect the fact that this was his example of engaging the person most not like him. A Samaritan woman who was from an ethno-religiously despised minority in midday, and she happened to be a harlot. That's my example. Now, I take that seriously. What does that mean for how I live my life? as you'll see in these future these slides coming, it means I'm engaging communists and Islamists and Salafis. I believe they're made in the image of God. And I'm told to love enemies as well as neighbors. Here's the larger point. If we just go back to the previous slide. I have to exhibit that here to impact there. That's all I want you to take away from that. There's a new thing out from UNHCR called Welcome the Stranger. It's awesome. You should look at it and find it. It's online. It's easy to find. 9 different faith traditions put from their holy text. What does it mean to welcome the stranger? The refugee. Every faith has something about it. What is it from your faith, or if you're a secular humanist, what is it from your moral framework that allows you to engage the other? And the UNHCR document is phenomenal because there's these 9 very different traditions that all essentially have the golden rule. I'm going to treat them as I wish to be treated. And that's the foundation for interagency engagement, non-state partnerships to deal with these issues. And as I'll get to in a second, this process of partnership, I'm also convinced that the top-down governments has to work with the grassroots bottom-up. If track 1 is government to government, track 2 is people to people, it's a track 1.5 world. Top-down and bottom-up have to work together, state and non-state actors, to get at these issues. And people, if you know what your philosophy of the other is, you will actually accelerate practical impact faster, as opposed to the USG response, which is water it down or not talk about it. Okay, next. Okay, so here's the bottom-up reality of the world you live in. This is not DC, this is the real world. And it's hard to see here, this is a GAO poll, but it's the greener you get, the more religious. And the bottom line is, according to Pew, 84% of the world believes in something greater than themselves. That's a hard fact to ignore. It's also to say that you can't put faith in a bucket or a category. It permeates all categories. It doesn't mean it's the dominant factor, but it means it's there. There are people of faith in all sectors, even in this room. Okay, next one. Which is to say this. Some people take their faith so seriously that they operate from the right-hand side. It is the prism through which they see all sectors. From an analytic point of view, especially here at GAO, you've got to allow for the fact that it's a factor. And then the mature person of faith has to balance both. Because this is the only way we can live with our deepest differences without killing each other. But this is where you bring your beliefs to bear in the public square and have honest conversations about how all faiths contribute to a common moral framework for the common good. That UNHCR document, Welcome the Stranger. It can be done. It takes some time to figure out. And it gets you squirmy sometimes because you don't want to talk about it, at least from your own side. And you certainly don't want to talk about it from the other because they might start breaking down some of the stereotypes you have of them. Right? I don't want to talk to the Muslims. They're the bad guys. I love Muslims. I love Salafis. There's a lot of things I disagree with them, but I will meet with them and talk to them. Okay, let's go this one. Now, here's another bottom-up reality. This is a terrible slide, but I just stuck it in there to illustrate the point. This is Brian Grimm. He's a really good guy. He's in China right now, giving a brief. And he gave a TED Talk. And if you have not seen this, you should see it. It comes from the Vatican, TEDx, and that's got the Italian there in case you didn't believe it was the Vatican. And he makes a simple argument. Where there is less religious freedom, and he's a sociologist of religion. And so he's into all the nerdy empirical stuff, which a lot of you guys are into. He makes the case where there's less religious freedom, there's less economic development, less women's empowerment, and more political instability. He can demonstrate that empirically. And what he is doing for all of us is the great favor of creating an on-ramp for everybody to come into the conversation. Much like grand strategy, as it gives you permission to participate, these neutral numbers say, look at authoritarian government XYZ, these are facts, what are you going to do with them? Not unlike GAO. We're giving you the data, you decide, you're the policymaker. He's doing the same thing from the academic field. And this is brand new stuff. This is cutting edge. He has a book out, The Price of Freedom Denied, 2011. He's the leading best guy in the world on these issues. And you just watch the TED Talk for 20 minutes, and you'll be set. Here are the lessons learned. This is like the last 15 years of my life in one slide, okay? All religions local. Don't you dare try to stereotype somebody by saying those Muslims, those Hindus, those monks, those Christians. All religion is local. You can't understand religion unless you understand how it's being taught and lived in the local context. Full stop. No monoliths. If religion is part of the problem, it's got to be a part of the solution. It only stands to reason. We've all been taught by default, especially at our international relations schools, where there's kind of a de facto secular fundamentalism, which is we can't talk about faith here. I suffered through 36 graduate courses to get a union card called a PhD, and 2 of them talked about religion. This is pre-9/11, of course. But both times it was as a catalyst to conflict. It wasn't as a potential contributor to peace. Third one, only a changed mindset changes behavior. And if you really want to get down to it, only a changed heart changes the mind. And you're not going to get a changed heart if you're there talking to people saying, you know, I'm just not comfortable talking about that. Because what you're saying to those 84% of the people in the world who believe in something greater than themselves is that you don't want to respect them at the core of their identity. And what I have found is that if you find a way to talk with them and show respect, you can actually talk about irreconcilable theological differences, and then you accelerate practical impact as a result. But you got to be willing to feel squirmy, to use an academic phrase. Third one, you have to have the ongoing space. Or fourth one, where does this take place? What does it look like? Where is that safe space that you can come together and talk about these things that are difficult to talk about? And then the fifth one is what I've already said, top down, bottom up. It's got to be together, government and grassroots. Okay. The policy choices, I think, are this. If you're a society at large, am I going to tolerate or celebrate the minority among us? Tolerance isn't good enough. I want to celebrate them and allow them to bring the core of their identity to the table. So majoritarianism doesn't tell them to look like me, which is assimilation. Integration says, I'm going to let you bring that to the public square. And that's the policy decision for governments, for the state. Do we have an assimilationist policy or an integrationalist? Assimilate or integrate? What's your choice? We want a society that celebrates and a government that integrates. That's the American experience. That's the essence of our exceptionalism. We get it right about 51% of the time. It's the difference between Rhode Island and Massachusetts, for those of you who like history. When Roger Williams flees the soft theocracy of the church, saying you have to look like us. They fled Europe to do to others what had been done to them. We forget about that because Thanksgiving is about shoes and big belt buckles on the shoes and everybody's getting along. Well, they hung Quakers and witches in Massachusetts because they were a threat to the ecclesiastical civil order. There were no Quakers or witches hung in Rhode Island because they explicitly linked religious freedom to the civility of society and the stability of the state. Read the Rhode Island Colonial Charter of 1663. It's right there. That's America. But our history, as we all know, is riddled with us getting it wrong. And that's why we ought to have profound humility as we engage others overseas about this kind of stuff. Okay, there's your graphic summary of Track 1, Track 2 coming together for principled pluralism in a Track 1.5 world. Okay, next one. Now, what does this look like in the American context? This is a picture of the John F. Kennedy. I was in the Marine Corps for 9 years and got invited here with the SecNav, Secretary of Navy. This is July 4th, 2000. So you can see the World Trade Centers back there. 4 ironies to the attack. One is that we've been warned, but we treated it as a legal issue. It was a legal issue, but you know, when somebody's trying to kill you, that's usually a war. What are you going to do about that? Second is if the JFK, the carrier, the ultimate symbol of American hard power in the 20th century, if the JFK had been in the harbor that day, it wouldn't have protected us. National security is not going to be solved by gates, guns, and guards. It has to be more than hard power. There has to be a 3-dimensional element that includes soft power. Third, we were attacked from the bottom up. a non-state actor attacking the greatest power in recorded history. That don't make no sense. And then it further don't make no sense that they were religiously motivated because religion's supposed to be dead. We've all learned that in international relations schools. You learned it because you never talked about it. I'm a graduate of an international relations school. Okay? I can take these shots freely and funnily. So those are the ironies of the attack. So we've had to overcome some of these obstacles as we've grappled with them. Okay, case study. This is our guiding document for a part of the world that many would say has religion involved in it. And some would say that there's a conservative interpretation of a particular faith in this field. Okay, I'm not saying anything that isn't common sense. How many times does the word faith or religion or Islam appear in this document? 0. Okay, next one. Here is the Quadrennial Defense Review. Every 4 years, quadrennial, we review the Defense Department. How many times does the phrase religious freedom or religious engagement get mentioned in this 2010 document? 0. These are not trick questions, okay? Next one. Here's the quadrennial, whatever you call it, Diplomacy and Defense Review for the State Department. How many times religious freedom, religious engagement in a world where 84% believe in something greater than themselves? 0. Next one. This is an awesome thing. The United States National Action Plan on Women, Peace, and Security. It's marvelous we live in a country that would produce something like this. How many times is religious freedom, religious engagement, faith mentioned again? 0. The only thing less included in international affairs than religion is religious. That's 50%. How do you ignore that? Well, we're darn good at it. We're really good at it. Why? Back to this way we've been taught. Henry Kissinger, the grand poobah of realpolitik. We've all heard of him, right? The definitive work on diplomacy, 800 pages. No references to Asia or Africa, or except, of course, reference to the Europeans. So that's one problem. Second problem, you should never trust a book where the author's name is bigger than the title. There might be some issues going on there. And then the third, how many times do you think religion is mentioned in this book? Another 0. Okay, these are our cultural blocks. It's hard to talk about this stuff, but there it is. It's this giant elephant in the room and nobody wants to deal with it. Okay, so how are we trying to think about some of these things? So we call ourselves the Think and Do tank. And by the way, you've got our talking points down. That's great. So here's a picture of us thinking. Just want to document that. This is my dad. He was the first ambassador for religious freedom, former president of World Vision, so comes with that kind of background, and a former jarhead, former Marine. And this is Madeleine Albright, who fought the creation of the International Religious Freedom Office in her department, in the State Department, because she'd been raised in all those good international relations schools. She's a PhD in international relations from Columbia, I think. But she wrote a book called The Mighty and the Almighty, where she said, we got to deal with this factor, after she left office. And so we did a conference at a church that looked at how do you steward citizenship? Your national citizenship, your global citizenship, and your spiritual citizenship. That's thorny. That's tough. So here you have a Democrat talking about religion in an evangelical church. Must be a guy. Okay, next one. Here we're talking with the chaplains from, we have combatant commanders all around the world. I don't have to explain this to you guys. But each one has a senior chaplain. This is the first time they were all gathered in one place to talk about religious engagement. And it's just one conference. It hasn't been done since. And then the other thing, and by the way, this is all trying to illustrate this point. You have to have a space that brings people together. We have a center on women of faith and leadership. And here we brought everybody together in January. There you can see Ambassador Sujay. She's our Ambassador for Religious Freedom right now. And then to my left, 2 people, Serene Hamsho from the town of Hamas, Syria. And we've partnered with her mother, who created a all-women's college or madrasa for women back in 1992. It's since been burned by the government. But her mom went to the mullahs in her town in Hamas, Syria, where the Brotherhood was wiped out in 1982, and said, show me in the Holy Quran where I can't have a school for women. And they couldn't do it. So she started it. That's good. That's the common good. And so we're trying to have these conversations across political, theological boundaries about how our faiths speak into these kinds of things. Okay. We've also, once you have the space, then you've got to have the scholarship. Because the scholarship, you have to give, like Brian Grimm from Pew Forum and the TEDx thing at the Vatican, you have to give people a way to think about this. Otherwise, it's just opinions, and it's my opinion versus your opinion, then it can get into he said, she said, and that's not good. So we created a journal called the Review of Faith International Affairs, multi-faith. It's the best journal in the world on faith international affairs. You know why? It's the only one. And now it's published by Routledge out of UK. And we'd love to have you guys publish with us. As long as you take faith seriously and relates to international affairs, we welcome you. This was on the chaplaincy. Here's the book that we just did, Religion and Security. There's a picture I took up at the Khyber Pass, which I love, is this juxtaposition. If you can't read it, may peace prevail on earth. And then there's a guy with an AK-47. In a fallen world, from the Christian worldview, you got to have both. It's hard to do. What does that balance look like? How do you think about that? It's a dangerous world. How do you protect people from to practice their faith? And so what we did here, this is going to, in retrospect, will seem very rudimentary, but here's where the state of the field is. We had 9 different faith traditions talk about what does your faith say about security. Then we had 9 different international relations experts say, what does your understanding of your theory say about faith? And this is not rocket science. We're just trying to get people in the same room talking. And then we had 5 people writing case studies where both things came together. Former Yugoslavia, Israel, Palestine, Nigeria, Iraq, and there's one more. That's never been done before. Okay. We did this book on religion and foreign affairs. It brings everything together. If you ever wanted one-stop shopping on all issues related to faith, this is it. This is a collection of all the best articles that have been written in the last 20 years or so, to include the Melian dialogue from Thucydides, which is more than 20 years ago. Okay. So, we're still in the American context before we try to apply some of this overseas. What is our government trying to do? Well, our government, because of Hillary, she started thinking of a strategic dialogue with civil society, and she had 6 working groups: women's empowerment, labor, human rights, governance, religion, foreign policy, and philanthropy. And she basically said, hey, the top-down isn't getting this right. We're going to invite the bottom-up through these working groups and a Federal Advisory Committee to speak into U.S. foreign policy. This is what we spent the last year doing. This is May of 2012. And through that, next one, we had our own religion and foreign policy working group, which made the recommendation that there ought to be an Office of Religious Engagement at the State Department on behalf of the entire country. Because you'd have to do religious freedom, but there's so many things that need religious engagement. Where do people go to do that? If you're U.S. trying to have influence overseas, or if you're a religious community trying to impact U.S. policy overseas, there's no place to go. How do you have that conversation, especially if everybody's afraid to talk about it, especially at the State Department? So we had this thing, and this is still continuing. It's met once this year, but we're waiting until this office is announced, and nobody's quite sure when that will take place. Next one. Then we've also got, this also exists in this town, a bottom-up NGO roundtable. And the issue is so sensitive, we don't even call ourselves a group. We're a non-group. And we don't have members, we have participants. And we show up every 2 months, and you're welcome to come. We meet on Capitol Hill, and the first hour and a half is just the NGOs. And the second hour, we invite the government folks in. And we share ideas about religious freedom and what's going on in the world. It's like if you're a Star Wars fan, that first Star Wars movie in the bar scene, that's how eclectic it is. The entire political and theological spectrum. You just have to scratch this much, and everybody's going to be disagreeing about everything. But these guys all get along. There's a lot of love because they care about this issue from a nonpartisan point of view as Americans. And this is beautiful. This is March of 2012 last year. Up on this stage, you have Scientology, Catholic, Baha'i, secularist, and government officials. And I think, yeah, there's Judith over there too. She was part of this as well. But we're talking. We had all kinds of members of Congress come and speak, and we just did another event on this at the Cannon Caucus Room last week on June 27th. Same kind of thing. People care about this. This is America. If we can't get this right, we can't get anything right. Right? We can't talk to somebody that we disagree with. agree to disagree agreeably, then we're stuck. Of course, that might be an apt description of this town at the moment. But good people have to try and figure it out. Okay, next one. Now, what about overseas? I'm just going to share some pictures of Waldo in different places where it's not hard to find them. This is the Bethlehem side of the wall. Now, that can really get you mad depending on where you're coming from politically or theologically or whatever. And I care about your thoughts, but I don't care. Because that's a perception, and that perception is reality. How do we engage that? How do we think about that? You've got to be able to do that. Next one. This is September 12, 2012, in Tunis. This is our first engagement with Salafis, and this is that very morning Ambassador Stevens had been killed in Benghazi. And I'm sitting next to a Libyan Salafist. What do you do there? By the way, the Libyan said, "That's not my Islam. I'm sorry that your ambassador was murdered." Next one. We are the only ones. We're not the only ones with this issue. This is in Kashgar, southwest Xinjiang. We work with the Chinese government on some of these issues transparently. And this is a conversation with them having imams at the table talking about Chinese government policies in that region. Talk about sensitive. Next one. Here's the think tank that we work with at the Chinese State Council. We actually did 3 conferences in 3 different western provinces of China to talk about how provincial policies towards Muslim ethnic minorities, Hui, Uyghur, Kazakh, how they differ among the provinces. And then we brought them all together in Beijing. This is September 2010. And we saw the provincial people, government officials from different provinces arguing with each other about the differences in policies. Because some were making the situation worse, and some were making it better. And I was happy to say more about that in a non-taped environment. But the point is, China is thinking about this. And good on them. There's a lot of issues to critique. But they're talking about it, and you never would have known this, because it's hard to talk about religion, and then we have the monolith, the communists are all bad guys. Also on China, we were asked to put together a dialogue in Tibet. This is our Tibetan NGO partner with our Chinese partners. I'm going to China next week, to the plateau, and then to Shanghai, bottom up, top down. We have the only ongoing dialogue that includes the diaspora and Tibetans from the plateau and the Chinese government. All under the radar, all soft, and all demonstrating that people of faith have something to say. We first talked about bilingual education, and now we're talking about conservation. What does that have to do with anything that I'm talking about? Nothing on the face of it. But it demonstrates that people of faith, in this case Buddhists in Tibet, have something to bring to the table according to the best of their faith and their language and their culture and about where they live. Next one. This is a religion and rule of law conference that we do, that we've attended and been a part of for 4 years. That's why Brian Grimm is in China right now. He's speaking at this. Educating people about what does my culture say, what does my current constitution say about respecting the other, registering NGOs, those kinds of things. This is all being done way under the radar. Next one. This is Vietnam. Another example, that's Uncle Ho back there. That's the president of Vietnam. His successor is coming to town, apparently, according to the Wall Street Journal this morning, by the end of the month. But we have top-down access here. Next one. And here we are briefing the internal think tank of the Communist Party here in Washington last month about how to engage religious communities. Who knew? People were asking these questions in authoritarian places. Next one. And we've created a space in Vietnam where, in this case, it happens to be Protestants from the Highlands who are all ethnic minorities who fought with the U.S. during the war. Now they have a national space to have conversations with the government directly about how their faith contributes to the well-being of society. This is our 3rd conference in a row that we've done in Hanoi. And it gets put on TV. Then you get access to the remote places. This is up in the northwest of Vietnam. Next one. And then you get asked by, in this case, the minority church to do conflict resolution in the religious community so they can talk to the government. And this is my definition of success: Asians teaching Asians, and an IGE, our little logo, and the government in the background. And then this, I just love this picture. This is Laos and Luang Prabang, which is the ancient capital of Laos up in the north. There's not too many places left in the world where you can sit under the visage of Karl Marx and Vladimir Lenin and hold the collected works of Kim Jong-il in English. True story. But also to say that they've had religion intentionally educated out of their worldview. They have no idea how to even think about this. And you know, right now as we speak, we've got 57 leaders from around Laos, Muslim, Buddhist, Catholic, and Protestant, meeting in the capital, Vientiane, to talk with government officials about Decree 92, which is the government's ordinance on religious freedom. After 10 years of relationship building trust. It's a town hall in a communist atheist society to talk about faith. These things are possible. Okay. So here's my concluding set of slides. This is a great quote from John Paul II. Basically, I should not be threatened by someone from another faith tradition. There's something holy in all faith traditions, and let's have our differences. This is the chief minister of the Northwest Frontier Province, now called Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, up in northwest Pakistan. He's a friend of mine. He's a Deobandi. He has prayed in my house in Fauquier County, an hour west of here, facing east. I disagree with him on almost everything, theologically at least, and politically, mostly. But we had a conference on Muslims and Christians, and he went out of his way, without me even asking, to invite the Sikh and the Hindu and the Shia and the Ismaili also into the conference. And this is what successful is. This is the best of America, but this is the best of the human condition. Can you create that space where they're all at the same table on a regular basis? And after the conference, the Hindu and the Sikh came to me and apologized for taking twice their podium time. You know, me, a typical Westerner, said, I don't care. They said, no, you don't understand. We've never been given a platform to speak about how our faith contributes as Pakistanis to the well-being of our society. That's what it takes. Okay. I put this here because you guys are all policy wonks, and I'm not going to go through it, but I think there are a lot of issues that can be thought through for the future about religion. From the top down, other countries are beginning to have offices of international religious freedom. There's ways to think about this, and there's a lot of bottom-up issues that need a whole lot of research. We're 10 people, and us and Doug Johnson, the other guy who wears this seersucker suit at the International Center for Religion Diplomacy, we're the only ones sort of doing this in the field. There's a lot of great folks here, but we're the ones that are going back and forth. And there's a lot of research issues that we could use your help on, or any insight that you might have. And the last one, that's our model in a nutshell. So I will stop there. I am totally unaware of time, but hopefully we have some Q&A. And yes, ma'am.
Very interesting talk. Thank you very much, and an often neglected subject here in government. Do you have any comments on what's going on in Egypt right now, and especially what might portend for the future and perhaps the immediate future, given that Ramadan has just started?
Yeah, great question. And thanks for the softball to just sort of kick it off. So I'm not going to give you comments. I'm going to give you. So let's just. I'll take advantage of my NGO plan. And I can also send you an interview that just is about to come out that we did with the equivalent of the Canadian Council on Foreign Relations, where I lay some of this out. So let's just be frank. One is U.S. policy doesn't exist. Our policy is so inept that the Muslim Brotherhood thinks we stood against them. And then all the people who are against the Muslim Brotherhood think we're with the Muslim Brotherhood. I don't know how you get there, but we got there. That's a leadership issue. That is not a political comment. That is a leadership issue. So that's one thing. The second thing is, was it a coup? That's a huge debate. I think that's silly. It was a coup. Coup is a coup is a coup. But everybody's reacting to this coup because it's our classic definition of a coup. I think there was a coup back in November of 2012 when Morsi put himself above the law. Nobody talked about that because we're just going to keep working with them, right? It doesn't matter whether it's Mubarak or Morsi, we're going to work with the government. That's a fault. Nobody stood up against that back in November 2012, and then all the subsequent events that took place, like he was putting people in governorships that used to be with terrorist groups, like in Luxor. And this last thing, which I think was what the military forced them to cross the Rubicon, was he was on the stage with radical clerics who were calling for jihad against the Shia in Syria. What were we saying? Do we even know it took place? So I think our role is we have lost a ton of credibility on this. So how do you get out of this? And oh, by the way, our non-leadership is only matched by the non-leadership in the region and the world. We don't have global leaders anymore. Turning this into a therapy session, but just hold with me. So what do you do now? And by the way, the other thing that's not discussed almost anywhere is the ultimate backdrop in the Middle East, North Africa, is the Sunni-Shia competition. The religious freedom issue in the Muslim majority world is among Muslims. They're killing each other, just like Protestants and Catholics used to kill each other. The human condition will evolve, but you have to find a way to evolve in an exegetically orthodox manner. How do my holy scriptures not validate killing Catholics if I'm a Protestant? The same thing has to take place between Sunni and Shia. So here's my short answer on the way forward. 1, call it a coup. 2, cease aid. Cease aid because that's what our law says, and we have to demonstrate we're a rule of law society. But I'm more concerned about Islamists drawing the conclusion that we did democracy and you took it away, so now I'm going underground and going violent. I don't care about our law. I think it's important. But it's more important to send the signal from a national security perspective to keep them at the table. I want the Brotherhood and the Salafis at the table. I would rather them be in the open than underground. And then call a reconciliation conference that brings everybody to the table and says, hey, let's hear the roadmap, but everybody participates. And then we'll turn your aid back on. We turn the aid off for 2 weeks. Stop the jets from the 4 jets that we're sending over there the next week or so. Stop it. We're serious about this, guys. But nobody's going to do that. We're too afraid of losing leverage with the military, and the Europeans are being willy-nilly. And then the Gulf, as you've probably seen, Qatar and Saudi and UAE, $12 billion package right now. They're doing the Marshall Plan that we should have been doing, or leading. And they're doing it because they're fearful of the Brotherhood infiltrating them and them losing their autocracy. So it's complex, but I think that's the way to go forward and be transparent and behold to our own rule of law and send a signal that keeps people who might go violent at the table. Sir?
How is our view of religious freedom perceived abroad, and how do you contrast that with the atheistic view, which, let's say, communist countries have? So how do you explain that it's not part of us, but it is part of us? I mean, how is that contrast understood and explained?
That's a great question. The first thing is whenever you go abroad, especially if you're engaging the kinds of folks I do, you have to go as the punching bag. In my experience, I'm often the first American and first Christian they've ever met. And that means that you become their therapy session because they've never been able to take it out on somebody. And you know what? There's a lot of proof. We supported Mubarak for 60 years. I'd take it out on me too. Or Pakistan, leaving Afghanistan in 1989. That's the first thing you will hear when you go into Peshawar or Bandung, down at the north-south Waziristan border. So, one is be ready to do that. Second is be humble and know your own history. And what I tell folks when I engage is say, we don't have the answers here, folks. This is, I think we're talking about something that comes from God. You need to know that. If you think that's a Western concept, I can't help you there. I think it's a Middle Eastern concept and it's universal, but it starts in the Middle East. But that's where I'm coming from. And let me share with you some of our faults. How about slavery? And then you just go on from there. How about the way we treated Asians? The way we're treating Hispanics and Mexicans? There's plenty of material, sadly. And then we say, okay, look, I don't want to be the bad guy beating you up, but I want to come alongside the best of who you are. Every culture, every religion has a mechanism for respect. Welcoming the stranger. I want to celebrate who you are and be your ambassador back to my country because you're known as a dark communist place. I know people who think that Rambo is a documentary, Vietnam. I want to tell your story in a different way. And then the other thing that I find is relationships of trust are built based on this honesty, is that at some point they will break down. And I've had communists whisper to me a couple things on the interest and value side of the coin. The interest side of the coin is, hey, we know that we can't get away from this, we'll deal with it. You're being a hegemon, and we respect that because that's what hegemons do. Hedgehog, whatever you want to call it. But the second piece, which is more fun personally, is they will say to me, I've had Vietnamese say this to me, you know, we're not all atheists. We worship our ancestors. And then they open up and share about every home throughout Southeast Asia has a corner for their ancestors. Incense. Well, that's a point of commonality. I'm here to respect your ancestors. I want everybody to respect your ancestors. And if they choose to practice another faith, I want you to respect them too. Because if you repress them, they're going to agitate against the state eventually. So it's not the right thing to do, it's in your self-interest. And that's what it comes down to. But usually you have to start with self-interest and then back end into the right thing. Sir?
How does your model or your approach incorporate sex from whatever faith that may have already become radicalized or extreme in some way? Is it the same approach, or does it differ in any way?
It has to stay the same for the sake of consistency. We don't talk to terrorists, if that's where you're going with it. On the other hand, I think that only the best of faith can defeat the worst of religion. And only somebody from within that camp can make that argument. I say to my communist friends all the time, I had lunch with the Vietnamese ambassador, he said, how do I improve my image in this town? He didn't say it quite like that, but that was the gist of it. And I said, look, here's the bottom line. I'm a former Marine and a Protestant Christian. You're a communist. Who do you think they're going to listen to? But I'm not saying jack until we see some progress on the things that we've agreed upon. I need to have integrity in my action. It's the same thing in the Salafi context. I know Salafis that I believe to be democratic and peaceful. I think Salafis can act as mediators in places like Mali and maybe even in Egypt. Now that blows anything out of the water here in this town, because all we know is Salafis are the bad guys, and we don't even know that Al-Noor was formed in response to the Brotherhood, and then Al-Watan broke from Al-Noor. I see that as the human condition and good for the politics of balance, checks and balances on each other naturally, let alone the institutions that are still immature. But the larger point is you have to speak from within that. A Salafi can argue against a Wahhabi. And I'm using shorthand there for super orthodox, and Wahhabi is violent extremism. All Wahhabis are Salafis, but not all Salafis are Wahhabi. How do we engage that way? Who has been empowered to have that conversation in an ongoing fashion? I don't know of anybody in the town that's doing this, or in our government. So there's a long way to go. Sir?
I've got a question that you probably will start by thinking is a policy question, but it's really a religion question.
Okay.
How does anybody in an out-group, you being an American Protestant Christian, talking to anybody who's not, get involved in the intramural battles within a particular ethno-cultural faith tradition and not be seen to be pursuing a very narrow and parochial set of interests?
Oh, sure. Sure. I mean, that's the first thing. I'm the worst. I had a imam from Oman say this to me. He said, Chris, you are a former Marine and an evangelical. You are my worst nightmare. Okay. I'm happy to I'm those things. But they think I'm CIA or they think I'm a missionary or both, right? It's the worst of all worlds. And all you can do is continue to engage.
And let me just interrupt for a second and say, like, you want to go to those Islamic communities and say, you're an advocate for ijtihad.
Yes.
You want them to have that conversation. But how, I'm just asking you, in your experience, empirically, how do you convince them of that?
You don't. I leave that, if I can be spiritual for a second, I leave that to God. There's some people who you don't talk to. Some people you meet once and you go, never talking to him again. And, you know, lo and behold, 5 years later, you're talking to them again because of a whole bunch of things. The second thing is, how do you show respect? And the first way to show respect is to show up and shut up. That's my theology, basically. And then you listen. And then you try to come alongside what, from my tradition, I believe God to already be doing in that culture for all people who he's made. Then the next thing you do is, form of respect, is that you keep showing up. There's a lot of junkies or emergency junkies or travelers who just want to be in the latest hotspot. How many different people in Afghanistan or Iraq, people who live there, how many Americans have rotated through? I mean, the policy question is, who stewards the relationships from our government on some of these key things? That's why we need an Office of Religious Engagement. But it's only the third or fourth time that you come back that they go, okay, your yes is yes and your no is no, and you respect me for who I am and what I believe, where I live. The next element of respect is to be familiar with some of the stuff and just say, I can't be an expert. So ijtihad. I'm not going to say, I'm here to help you do ijtihad. But when I say, I've heard within Sunni tradition that ijtihad's been closed since 1258, fall of Baghdad. But others who believe themselves Orthodox Sunni and Shia, they think ijtihad is alive as a function of their orthodoxy.
Can you please put your phone on in the VTC room?
Whoever's in either San Francisco or LA, we can hear the door closing and voices. So if you could put the phone on mute, that would be great.
Thank you. So, but do you have enough knowledge to demonstrate respect for the culture and what they're going through? I'll give you another example that gets people in trouble is takfir. Takfir is Arabic for apostate. Now, you could use the word takfiri terrorist, right? Which is nice because it's alliterative and it might play. But if you're not a Muslim, you calling another Muslim takfir, only Muslims get to call Muslims takfir. But you can have that conversation and say, how do you understand the concept of takfir? Now I'm showing respect for your theology. I want to learn from you about how you engage that. How do you say that that's not my Islam, as that is Libyan Salafist said to me on September 12th last year? That's the way to do that. And over time, for all the nuance about culture and language, the heart's got to speak. And sometimes it does and sometimes it doesn't. But I have found that there are people who have the same heart trying to think the same way because they're global citizens and they take their faith seriously. And they really don't like their faith in the Islamic context being known as the faith of terrorism. And so they're anxious to have the conversation. But it's a delicate process and you make lots of mistakes along the way. Great question.
Just because we have a few minutes left, is there anyone who's listening either on the phone bridge or on their computers who has any questions?
Maybe a little left.
Anyone else in headquarters?
Yes, ma'am.
So you've been talking about bottom up, and at the beginning there we kind of looked at QDR, QDDR, and all these other top-down documents, and I was sort of curious, really, as you know, oftentimes there are attempts from the bottom up to create policy, but only in the form of like commander intent sort of thing, or have you seen anything out there? I don't know if you've looked into this, but sort of attempts from the bottom up within the Department of Defense or State Department, given that the office you'd really like to have exist doesn't exist. Have you seen people trying to make that happen from a bottom up sort of way?
Yeah, great question. My answer to this is ultimately it has to be top down and driven down. Just like Goldwater Nichols instituted the 4 services working together, 5 services working together. That's the only way it's going to happen. It has to come from Congress. And Congress, by the way, is getting engaged. They just had their first hearing on the Religious Freedom Act in the 15 years since the act last month. So there's a little bit of hope there. From the bottom up, my experience in the military is that the good commanders are going to do this instinctively, and they don't care about any. They just want, because it's force protection and it's force multiplication effort. If I want to achieve my mission, I've got to work with the local imam or whatever the religious leader is. In terms of institutionalizing it, the chaplaincy has tried to think about this. The Army chaplaincy has tried to think about this. And the only reason I know that is I helped design and teach their social, cultural, religious engagement course for 3 years. But there's a big debate within the chaplaincy. Hey, I joined to do pastoral care. I did not join to engage a Buddhist monk in Myanmar or a Shia and Sunni cleric in Herat. That's not my deal. And so that's the next question that happens is how does this get institutionalized in a culture to say maybe we need chaplains in every agency as the social, cultural, religious attaché. I think that's where this goes at some point. But there's a lot of things that have to be thought about, and there's only a few bottom-up initiatives, and it's really not going to happen until the top-down of Congress says you're going to have this training, you're going to have this professional development. What do we call this, PDP or PDP stuff, PME in the military, professional military education, if you want to get promoted. But that's what Goldwater Nichols did. You're going to be educated with Marines, even though you think they're the dumbest knuckle-draggers in the world, if you want to see colonel. And I'm a product of that system, so I have a bias. I went to the Naval Postgraduate School, and I learned that not all Army people are dogs, and that not all Air Force people are zoomies and wing wipers in civilian division, and that not all Navy people are squids. And that's how you do it. Education and training is the only way you change a mindset. That's probably a good note to end on. Thank you for your time and your service to our country.